A very short analysis of Russia's strategic objectives would be that the last 8 months have not been very good for Russia. This is an uncontroversial statement. However, where the war might be going now, Russia has mobilized at least 300,000 men, might not be so obvious. The deteriorating situation in western Kherson, indicating the potential of Ukrainian forces to liberate Kherson city and the entire west bank of the Dnipro, will have strategic importance far beyond the immediate Kherson-Zaporizhzhia front. In addition, Belarus is potentially acting as a springboard for a new Russian invasion from the north. And in addition to this, the bombing of the Kerch Bridge is going to compound these issues for Russia substantially. Here we're going to touch on what developments we have seen over the last few weeks, where we might expect the focus of the war to shift next, and the consequences of the developments that we have seen. Ukraine likely knows that they need to prepare their defensive positions across the Belarusian and Russian border regions, not only to improve actual odds of a successful defense, but to deter Russia from renewing an offensive in these regions of Ukraine freed from Russian occupation since the initial Russian withdrawal in spring 2022. In particular, there has been a lot of noise about Belarus entering the war. However, I find this unlikely for several reasons. Firstly, Belarus does not have a lot to offer Russia in terms of combat power. Belarus's ground forces train only up to platoon-level operations, with very occasional battalion-level operations. Belarus currently has 10,000 active-duty ground forces, and Lukashenko's domestic position is not as seemingly bulletproof as Putin's is. So there are mitigating factors that may weigh on Lukashenko on deciding whether to enter the war and whether it is in his best interests. Spoiler alert, it probably is not. Another possibility is that Belarus is used as a springboard for Russian forces, like it was in February. The reason I believe this is also unlikely is this time Ukraine is fully expecting an attack from this direction. Russian troop movements into Belarus have been broadly telegraphed. Ukraine has had ample time since May to reinforce its defences in this direction. Indeed, Ukraine has been reported to have recently blown bridges and roads leading into Belarus, a sign of their preparedness for any action in this direction. I would posit this is likely more of the same tactic Russia has been using to fix Ukrainian forces up north. Whilst Belarus has stated 170 tanks will be transferred from Russia, in actual fact Belarus has, very quietly, transferred 95 T-72As to Russia, along with trucks and a range of small arms and ammunition. Belarus's MOD has telegraphed this massing of troops in both English and Spanish on their official Twitter. Contrast this to February, when the backdrop to an actual invasion was that of complete operational silence, and I would argue this widely reported massing of troops in fact only serves the purpose to tell Ukraine and its allies that yes, Russia is still defending Belarus, whilst, very quietly, the actual combat power in Belarus has remained constant or even decreased in material terms. The risk of an invasion from Belarus is therefore not impossible, but at this point apparently unlikely in the next 3 months at least. Geographical features would complicate the picture for an invasive force too. The Pinsk marshes cover the border region of the majority of the Belarusian and Ukrainian border, and served as geographic barriers in both world wars. Much of it is heavily forested, and poorly furnished with population centres or infrastructure. Not to mention the Belarusian border has far fewer roads per kilometre than the Russian-Ukrainian one, which means Ukraine will be able to concentrate its troops and defences over a smaller area, therefore improving the likelihood of a successful defence. All these reasons provide a strong incentive for Belarus to merely use its geographic location to threaten Ukraine, as it has been doing, rather than actually risk all of the consequences from an actual invasion. On another front entirely, in the south, the Kherson counteroffensive is rumoured to be gearing up again. In addition, Russia is telegraphing it may be about to retreat from the western bank as its position becomes increasingly untenable. Putting aside concerns that Russia may be attempting to mislead Ukrainian and Western observers with these signals, here is what I think the consequences for a liberation of Kherson might be. The liberation of the west bank of the Dnipro will provide a significant propaganda victory for Ukraine, both for native Ukrainians, and for Western backers. And the Dnipro will also provide a strong natural barrier, which Ukraine can defend with fairly minimal manpower in comparison to the current front, spread over 150 kilometers of open terrain. This front has been the exact opposite of the type of offensives we have seen in Kharkiv and Kiev. This has been a grueling front for Ukraine to defend and push through. Until the most recent counteroffensive, the front changed by tens of meters a day. The Ukrainians essentially adopted a strategy of grinding down Russia through locally surpassing Russian firepower using Western HIMARS and M270 launchers to destroy logistical routes for Russia west of the Dnipro. This was a strategy adopted out of necessity, not by preference. Ukraine lacked the mechanized formations and air power to conduct a blitzkrieg-style counteroffensive in this area, where Russia has been entrenching themselves for months, and which largely covers open, steppe terrain. As such, the current Kherson offensive has been a stop-start affair, with Ukraine continually grinding down Russian forces that are incapable of being adequately resupplied or relieved, to the point where the line collapses, and the Russians have had to retreat and then defend a smaller, pre-established secondary line. Recent messaging from Russia and open-source Ukrainian intelligence suggests Russia may be preparing to withdraw across both bridges, and then blow up the Kakhovka Dam in an attempt to inflict severe damage to the city of Kherson, and up to 80 settlements around the Dnipro River. Either way, the conclusion of recent data appears to me to be Russia preparing to abandon the West Bank altogether, as its defense becomes increasingly infeasible. The capture of the West Bank will allow Ukraine to divest current manpower currently engaged in Kherson, and guard the front with only a relatively small garrison compared to their current manpower investments. The Dnipro River is a substantial natural barrier which Russia will not be able to assault without extremely high rates of attrition. The two remaining bridges are severely damaged at present, and unable to sustain an assault without repairs, and an attempted river crossing would be suicide. The most likely scenario for this freed-up manpower is to be transferred up north, across the Ukrainian-held crossings in Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk, and being deployed to the eastern and southern fronts across the winter or spring. This will also allow Ukraine to solidify their defensive positions in the north and the east, whilst Russia attempts to mobilize more manpower and possibly prepare for a renewed offensive in the spring. The capture of Kherson, however, will also ensure that any seaborne invasion of Odessa and Mykolaiv and the invasion of western Ukraine, including from Transnistria, is utterly untenable. Now, obviously, this possibility is already untenable. However, with a large portion of Ukraine's forces tied down engaging Russian forces around Kherson, Russia has been able to continuously threaten Ukraine with the possibility of the involvement of Russian troops currently deployed in Transnistria. However, with the western bank of the Dnipro secured, Russian aspirations west of the river will die permanently, beyond the scope of this war. As without the threat of Russian BTGs pouring over the Antonovsky Bridge and into southwestern Ukraine, the Russian troops in Transnistria lack the materiel or manpower to threaten Ukraine on their own. Similarly with a Russian seaborne invasion, due to the now firmly established threat of Neptune missiles and Ukrainian drones repeating a Moskva on the Russian Navy, the only feasible possibility of a seaborne invasion was in the case of a successful expansion of Russian positions on the west bank of the Dnipro along the coast. With the liberation of Kherson, Russia will not be able to leverage their navy or Transnistria to threaten the whole southwest of Ukraine in any realistic capacity. Beyond bombing population centers, which, whilst extremely painful for Ukrainian civilians, is no threat to Ukraine's military. Essentially, this will allow a disproportionate number of Ukrainian troops to be freed up for combat relative to the area of territory that will be liberated on the west bank of the Dnipro. This will set the stage for the next phase of the war. As Ukraine regains the west bank of the Dnipro, Russia may begin sending, what is likely to be based on OSINT evidence, undertrained, poorly motivated soldiers to fight. These men will probably be, again based on OSINT evidence, either under-equipped or equipped with a wide variety of equipment, which there is evidence to suggest will be of dubious quality. With the destruction of the Kerch Bridge, all of this is thrown into even greater relevance. The Kerch Bridge was the main supply for Russian rail logistics for their troops in the south of Ukraine. Now, Russia must transport their supplies down south through the Donetsk-Mariupol-Melitopol route. Either by rail or by road, this will have severe restrictions on their ability to resupply their southern forces, due to the southern route being almost entirely in range of Ukrainian HIMARS and M270 launchers. If Russia starts to supply its forces by the southern road route, available over the surviving Kerch Bridge section, this will mark a far less efficient transport of supplies due to the simply underrated fuel efficiency of rail transport. If Ukraine has its troops freed up from defending a disadvantaged front in Kherson, and if buoyed by recent successes and equipped with Western-provided winter gear and weapons, it will be reasonably well prepared to defend against the new masses of Russian troops. Again, this is simply an opinion. What will determine any possible success for Russia, barring the use of tactical nuclear weapons, which at this stage still seems unlikely, is the degree to which they can prepare their troops and fix their communication and logistical issues. However, there are currently no signs that Russia is mobilizing its resources to fix these issues. All signs indicate that Putin and the Russian army and Wagner are still relying on the time and tested Russian methods of shoveling troops into the meat grinder, backed up by a strong artillery arm, which has proven less and less effective in the context of Ukraine. All Russia will be able to do with its first wave of conscripts is plug the large gaps in its existing units, and not construct a fully equipped fighting force to field as additional combat power. In conclusion, the recapture of Kherson, as Colonel Ben Hodges put it, is the beginning of the end of the road for Russia, and all roads, eventually, lead to Crimea.